turn to our third panelist online. So we have, can you see her? I can see her, but I don't know if the audience can. Sarah Anne Rennick, who is Deputy Director at the Arab Reform Initiative. Okay, you can see her. Okay, so Sarah, you heard both Noor and Hussein talk about Gaza and Lebanon. So if we place reconstruction within a wider international shift towards securitized peace building and more managed forms of international order, how does that help explain why reconstruction is increasingly organized through control and stabilization rather than through political self-determination? And based on this and on what you heard from Noor and Hussein about Gaza and Lebanon, are we witnessing a new model that will be generalized globally, or is this specific to the region? Please go ahead. You have 6, maximum 8 minutes, and I hope you have a counter. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thanks for my previous two panelists for these really interesting remarks. I'm going to try to situate my remarks, their remarks within a broader discussion about how we've seen over the last few decades an increasing dispossession of local agency and local priorities and a human security approach in processes of reconstruction and processes of post-conflict peace building. And these mirror the broader geopolitical shifts that have been occurring over the last few decades. And what we've seen emerging is that reconstruction has become increasingly a tool of subordination, of control, of extractivism. And this is within the mindset of the victor's peace, that these geopolitical tendencies have been pushing forward this victor's peace, where the priorities of reconstruction, what gets to be reconstructed, who decides, and for what purposes is increasingly within the mindset of what serves the victors or what serves external actors. So what we've seen over the last few decades is this retreat of the liberal international order and this rise of this competing authoritarian international order, and most recently, the rise of a transactional and extractivist diplomacy on the part of the Trump administration that has been pushing these dynamics and this dispossession of local agency, local decision-making, and the priority on sort of the human dimensions and human security dimensions. Because obviously reconstruction is not just about infrastructure, it's not just about buildings, it's also about political systems, health systems, education systems, social protection systems, social cohesion. But what we're seeing is that these issues get completely removed off the table as we see an increasing emphasis on securitization of the state at the service of realpolitik and interests of global international powers. And so if we trace this dispossession, this disappropriation of the local and of these sort of everyday peace activities, and the idea of building back systems that are going to lead to addressing forms of inequality, forms of hierarchy, and creating systems that are more sustainable and that actually meet the needs and aspirations of local populations. This did not only just start in the last decade or even the last few years. This has been a process that's been ongoing for a number of years. To varying degrees, the approach of the international peace architecture, which I mean institutions such as the UN, the World Bank, the global international order, has always been, to a certain extent, with a mindset of realist ontologies. We've seen a very state-centered approaches, but within the idea, traditionally, the last few decades back, within this sort of neoliberal, liberal state-building, peace-building process, where we're trying to build states that are within the neoliberal mindset, within liberal frameworks about protection of rights. This has already started to shift as of 9/11, where we see that stability becomes more important. Things like what Noor was suggesting, the counterinsurgency, clamping down on the domestic issues, clamping down on civil society to a certain extent, and on domestic threats as part of securing the state. That becomes a vision of peace building. And so, there's much to criticize about the Western-backed liberal international order and the way reconstruction, peace building was framed within this order. This was very top-down heavy, very much an emphasis on elites, on formal political institutions, formal procedures, but with this dimension of securitization about trying to prevent emerging threats from within society. and the emphasis on the free market economy, what ends up happening is this plays very much into the hands of elites and of unjust regimes. So the accusation that peace building and reconstruction are serving the Western interest and the elite interest is, of course, not at all exaggerated. This was the dynamic we were seeing. However, with the move to multipolarity and the retraction of the Western imposed liberal international order, while this in theory could have allowed for a rising of a new vision for what constitutes peace and how do we come to peace that takes into account visions from the global South, what we see instead is this competing authoritarian international order that has been arising. It's an approach to peace building that favors an escalation of conflict initially, an escalation of invasion, dynamics of partition, colonization, and forced displacement, all of these as a prelude to processes of peace building and reconstruction in order to ensure this victor's peace. So this is a mindset that pushes even further this state-centric approach and shuts down local agency and local priorities and the social dimensions of reconstruction. So reconstruction is increasingly about the division of spoils, about territorial and economic power, and the maintenance of hierarchies in service of global powers. Under the Trump administration, what we've seen is this rise of transactional diplomacy and extractive capitalism. And these become the explicit purposes of reconstruction. And this plan is, of course, very visible in what we've seen with Gaza and in the 20-point plan that's been put forth by the Trump administration, where post-war reconstruction is being cast as a portfolio opportunity for the benefit of external powers. The emphasis is not only on stabilization and control, but on the externalization of governance and decision-making for the benefits of primarily Israel, but also the US and the cronies of the Trump administration. And what we see as well is the privatization of reconstruction for the purpose of investments that are deemed bankable, that are deemed profitable. And this squeezes out the space not only for local agency and local decision-making, which is clearly what's happened with the Palestinian voice and Palestinian rights and authority to participate and determine the priorities of peacemaking, of reconstruction, but also with international organizations who have also found themselves squeezed out or finding themselves squeezed out with this privatization of peace building and of reconstruction.
2 minutes, Sarah, please. Thank you.
1 minute. All right. And just as an example, and then I will conclude, one of the sectors that is in dire need of reconstruction in Gaza today is the higher education sector. This has been nearly completely destroyed, and yet for any viability of a society long-term, there is a need for a higher education sector. There's a need for a society to be able to produce knowledge about itself, for itself, to be able to develop the kinds of sectors and this long-term vision for itself. And yet the reconstruction is not only not on anyone's, it's not on any priority list, but there wouldn't be any possibility even for the Palestinians to have this kind of authority because of the way that the access to materials, access to decision-making, the ability to go about reinforcing their own homegrown initiatives for reconstruction have been moved completely out of the system at this point. What would be an alternative to this? Obviously would be giving rights and authority to the Ministry of Education, for example, setting up a committee that brings together Palestinian universities to kind of assess themselves what it needed. But this would require international organization, other powers such as the EU or other regional players such as Turkey or Qatar to have a role to play creating the funds and placing centrally the Palestinian vision within this reconstruction of this social sector that has not less to do with infrastructure, although infrastructure is part of it, but really allowing for this vision of reconstruction to come out. But this is going very much against the grain of these broader geopolitical dynamics that are not allowing for such systems to emerge. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you.